I was a child, my grandmother Anna seemed to me the kindest and brightest person on earth. She lived in an old wooden house on the outskirts of town, where the air always smelled of honey and herbs, and every corner held jars of tinctures and dried plants. My parents worked late, and I spent most of my childhood with her. She baked incredibly delicious pies, told stories I never heard anywhere else, and always knew how to soothe any pain, be it a scraped knee or a broken heart. Grandmother was a herbalist, as people in our small town called her. People came to her from all over the district for help. Some wanted to cure a chronic illness, some sought advice on personal matters, and some simply looked for comfort. She welcomed everyone, never refused anyone, and never took money for her help. People brought her food, fabrics, small gifts, but she never asked for payment. It seemed natural to me. Good people help others without expecting a reward. Her house was special. The rooms were filled with books, many of which looked very old, with cracked leather bindings and yellowed pages. On the shelves stood glass vessels with herbs, roots, and strange dried objects that I couldn't identify as a child. The walls were decorated with amulets, bundles of herbs, and drawings that, as I later understood, were not just decorative. Candles always burned in the house, even during the day, and the air was filled with the scent of frankincense and something else I couldn't place, but which created a special atmosphere of peace and security. Grandmother often told me that our family had a special gift, the ability to see and understand what was hidden from others. She said that this gift was passed down through the female line, but sometimes it could manifest in men too. As a child, I didn't understand what she meant, and I perceived her words as part of the fairy tales she told me. Now I understand that she was preparing me for what was inevitably to come. Years passed. I grew up, entered university in a neighboring city, found a job, and started my own family. Visits to Grandma became less frequent, first once a month, then once every few months, and then only on holidays. Life swept me away with its frantic pace, and it seemed I didn't have time for long tea gatherings with herbal infusions and unhurried conversations about the importance of listening to one's intuition. Working as a programmer in a large IT company demanded complete dedication. Deadlines, constant overtime, stress. This became my daily reality. I bought an apartment in a new neighborhood, married my colleague Natasha, and it seemed life was on the right track. We planned children, saved for a car, made plans for the future. Grandmother always rejoiced in my successes, but sometimes I caught a certain anxiety in her eyes that I couldn't understand then. In the last years of her life, I began to notice that she had changed. She became more withdrawn, often looking out the window with an expression I couldn't read. When I asked what was bothering her, she would just shake her head and say she was simply tired. People still came to her for help, but now she often refused complex cases, saying her strength wasn't what it used to be. The call came on a Friday evening. I was working late, finishing another project, when the phone rang. My grandmother's neighbor's voice trembled as she informed me that Anna Nikolaevna had died in her sleep. Quietly, peacefully, as if she simply hadn't woken up. The doctor said it was her heart, not uncommon at her age. She was 84 years old and had lived a long and seemingly full life. I remember driving to her house that night. The whole world seemed unreal, as if I was watching a film about someone else's life. Natasha offered to come with me, but I refused. I needed to be alone to process what had happened. The road, which I had driven hundreds of times, seemed unfamiliar in the darkness. Streetlights cast strange shadows and familiar buildings looked alien and menacing. When I entered her house, the first thing that struck me was the silence. Not just an absence of sounds, but a peculiar dense silence that pressed on my ears. The candles that always burned in the house were extinguished. The air had lost its familiar scent of herbs and frankincense and had simply become empty. I turned on the light, but even the bright lamps couldn't dispel the feeling that the house was empty, not only physically, but spiritually. Grandmother lay in her bed, looking peaceful and calm. There were no traces of pain or fear on her face. It seemed she had truly just fallen asleep forever. I sat beside her until morning, holding her cold hand in mine and trying to accept the reality of what was happening. This was the first death of a loved one in my life, and I didn't know how to grieve properly. The funeral was quiet. Many people came, neighbors, acquaintances, those she had helped over the years. Everyone spoke of what a wonderful person Anna Nikolaevna had been, how much good she had done, how her wisdom and kindness would be missed. I listened to these words and felt they were true yet incomplete. There was something else people weren't saying aloud, some secret I couldn't decipher. After the funeral, I stayed in her house for a few days, sorting through things and trying to decide what to do with the inheritance. The house was old but sturdy, and it could be sold for a good sum. Natasha suggested we do just that. We needed funds to expand our apartment. But something inside me resisted the idea. The house was full of memories, full of a special energy that I couldn't define but that drew me in. The first few days after the funeral passed in a flurry. I needed to sort out documents, handle utility matters, and go through personal belongings. I methodically sifted through her clothes, kitchenware, and trinkets she had collected over the years. Each item carried a memory of her, and parting with them was difficult. But when I got to her library, I realized I had encountered something much more complex. The books were not just old. Many of them looked ancient. There were volumes in languages I couldn't identify, with symbols and signs that resembled nothing familiar. Some books were handwritten with ink that had turned brown over the years. The pages were filled with drawings, diagrams, formulas that had nothing to do with herbalism in the usual sense. I opened one of the books at random and saw detailed anatomical drawings of the human body, but not medical ones. They marked points, lines, symbols that clearly had some occult meaning. Another book contained calendars with lunar phases, calculations of planetary cycles, and instructions for rituals that made me feel uneasy. I realized that Grandma was not just a herbalist. She was involved in something much more serious and perhaps dangerous. This thought frightened me, but at the same time it explained much of what I had observed as a child but didn't understand. Her ability to always know what was happening to people, even if they said nothing. Her ability to heal not only the body but also the soul. The special atmosphere in the house that made people feel safe. At that time, I still didn't understand that these books were not just interesting artifacts of the past. They were tools, weapons in a struggle against forces I couldn't even imagine yet. And most importantly, they now belong to me. And with them all the obligations my grandmother had undertaken. For the next few weeks, I lived in a strange, semi-conscious state. I returned to my apartment, to my job, to the usual rhythm of life, but everything within me had changed. Natasha tried to support me, cooked my favorite dishes, suggested we go somewhere to relax, but I felt cut off from the ordinary world, as if an invisible wall stood between me and everything else. Sleep became a problem. Every night I had strange dreams, so vivid and realistic that in the morning I would wake up with the feeling that I had been somewhere, done something, but couldn't remember what exactly. In my dreams, I was often in my grandmother's house, but it looked different. Larger, older, with rooms I had never seen. There were basements descending deep underground, staircases leading nowhere, and corridors that seemed endless. In these dreams, I was constantly searching for something or someone. My grandmother's voice called to me from the darkness, but when I followed the call, I found only empty rooms and shadows that moved independently of any light source. I always woke up in a cold sweat with the feeling that something important had slipped away from me, that I had missed some critically vital information. Work became increasingly difficult. Code that once came easily and intuitively now caused me trouble. I made mistakes I had never made before, forgot about meetings, lost my train of thought in conversations with colleagues. Management began to express their dissatisfaction, but I couldn't explain what was happening. How do you tell someone that you're haunted by dreams of your dead grandmother, and that you feel as if part of your soul has remained in her old house? A month after the funeral, I decided to return to my grandmother's house. Officially, it was to finally sort through her belongings and decide on the sale, but in reality, I simply couldn't resist the strange pull that house had on me anymore. Natasha was against it, saying I needed to let go of the past and move on, but I felt I couldn't live normally until I dealt with what my grandmother had left me. The house greeted me with silence and the smell of dust. In the past month, it seemed to have aged years. The paint on the walls had faded, the floorboards creaked louder, and the air was heavy and stale. I opened the windows to air it out, but the fresh air brought no relief. It was as if the very atmosphere of the house was permeated with something oppressive. I started by systematically examining my grandmother's library. Most of the books were dedicated to what is commonly called occultism, astrology, alchemy, magic, spiritualism. But these were not popular editions for mysticism enthusiasts. They were serious studies, many written centuries ago by scholars and philosophers whose names I recognized from encyclopedias. One book particularly caught my attention. It was written in Old Church Slavonic, which I barely understood, but some phrases and symbols seemed familiar to me. The book was titled On the Connection Between Worlds and contained detailed descriptions of rituals and practices that, the author claimed, allowed a person to interact with forces existing beyond our material world. I was struck by the fact that the margins of the book contained notes made in my grandmother's hand. She wasn't just reading these texts. She was studying them, drawing conclusions, recording her own observations. In one place, she wrote, "The price is always higher than it seems at first. Every gift requires a sacrifice, and this sacrifice can affect not only you, but also those you love." These words made me wonder what my grandmother could have meant. What price did she pay for her abilities? And what were these sacrifices that could affect loved ones? I began to understand that her life was much more complex and dangerous than I had thought as a child. In another book, dedicated to practical magic, I found detailed instructions for creating protective amulets and charms. Grandmother not only studied these techniques but actively used them. I found many objects in the house that perfectly matched the descriptions in the book. Silver pendants with engraved symbols, stones with markings on them, bundles of herbs collected on specific days of the lunar cycle. Gradually, I began to understand that my grandmother's house was not just a dwelling, but a true fortress, protected from various kinds of negative influences. Every amulet, every herbal bundle, every symbol on the walls had its purpose in a complex system of defense, and now that she was gone, this system began to malfunction. The first signs that something was wrong appeared on the third day of my stay in the house. In the morning, I woke up to a strange sound. It seemed like someone was walking in the attic, though I knew for sure that no one else was in the house. The sound was distinct: footsteps, creaking floorboards, sometimes something falling with a dull thud. When I went up to the attic, I found nothing unusual, but the feeling of something alien and hostile being present was very strong. In the afternoon, problems with the electricity began. Lights flickered for no apparent reason, sometimes going out completely, only to turn back on a few minutes later. I checked the wiring, but it was fine. Moreover, the neighbors weren't complaining about power outages. The problems were only in my grandmother's house. In the evening, something happened that made me seriously consider that what was occurring might be supernatural. I was sitting in the living room reading one of my grandmother's books when I heard voices. They came from the kitchen, quiet but distinct, as if several people were arguing about something. I cautiously approached the kitchen and saw that it was empty, but the voices continued to sound. They spoke in a language I didn't understand, but the intonation was menacing. Sometimes among the incomprehensible words, familiar Russian phrases slipped through. "The time has come. The debt must be paid. The agreement is broken." I stood in the kitchen doorway, hesitant to enter, and felt goosebumps run down my spine. The voices continued for a few more minutes, then suddenly fell silent. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my grandmother's bed, listening to every sound, every rustle. The house lived its own peculiar life. creaking, groaning, whispering. Sometimes I thought I heard footsteps in the hallway, but when I went to check, no one was there. By morning, I was completely exhausted and began to seriously doubt my sanity. Perhaps the stress of losing my grandmother and my immersion in the world of occult books had affected my state. Perhaps all these strange phenomena were products of my imagination, fueled by nervous tension and lack of sleep. I had almost convinced myself of this when I found my grandmother's diary. It lay in a secret drawer of her writing desk, which I discovered by chance when the table shifted slightly, and I saw that one of its legs was shorter than the others. Hidden beneath it was a small lever. Pressing it opened a hidden compartment. The diary was thick, leather-bound, filled with my grandmother's small handwriting. The entries spanned many years. Some pages dated back to when I was only a few years old. Reading the diary, I learned things about my grandmother that fundamentally changed my perception of her. It turned out that she did possess supernatural abilities, but these abilities were not a gift in the usual sense of the word. They were the result of a covenant made many years ago with entities she called the Guardians of the Boundaries. According to her entries, these entities existed in the space between our world and other dimensions of reality. They possessed immense power and knowledge, but could not directly influence our world. For this, they needed intermediaries, people who voluntarily agreed to serve as a link between the worlds. In return for this service, the Guardians granted their intermediaries various abilities: foresight, healing, the ability to influence events, an understanding of hidden connections between things. But all this came at a cost. Each use of the gift demanded a portion of the intermediary's life energy, and the stronger the influence, the higher the price. Grandmother described in detail how she made this covenant. It happened in her youth when she was desperately in need of help. Her youngest son, my uncle, whom no one in the family ever spoke of, was terminally ill. Doctors couldn't help him, and she was willing to do anything to save her child. The Guardians offered her a deal. They would save the boy, but in return she would become their servant for life. She agreed, not understanding all the consequences of this decision. Her son recovered, but the price turned out to be higher than she could have imagined. Every time she helped people using her abilities, she gave a part of her life. But that wasn't the only payment. The Guardians required her to perform certain rituals to maintain protective barriers that prevented more dangerous entities from entering our world. The most terrifying thing I learned from the diary was that the covenant with the Guardians was not a personal contract, but a family obligation. It was passed down through inheritance, and now that my grandmother had died, all her obligations transferred to me. I was the only one in our family who possessed the necessary abilities to fulfill this role. In the last entries of the diary, made shortly before her death, my grandmother wrote about how she tried to find a way to break the covenant, to free the family from this burden. She studied ancient texts, consulted with other practitioners, and looked for loopholes in the terms of the agreement. But all her attempts were unsuccessful. I understand that I have condemned our descendants to the same fate as mine, she wrote. But then I had no choice. Now I see that my grandson is beginning to show abilities. He doesn't yet understand what is happening to him, but soon the Guardians will claim their rights. I pray that he will be stronger than me, that he will be able to find a way to break these chains. Reading these lines, I understood that the strange dreams that had haunted me for the past few weeks were not just a result of stress. The Guardians had already begun to contact me, preparing me to accept the inheritance. The sounds in the house, the voices in the kitchen, all these inexplicable phenomena. These were attempts by entities from another world to attract my attention, to make me realize the new reality. At the end of the diary was a detailed instruction on how to perform the ritual of accepting the inheritance. Grandmother wrote that I could try to ignore the call of the Guardians, but this would have catastrophic consequences. The protective barriers she had maintained for years had already begun to weaken, and without a new intermediary, they would completely collapse within a few weeks. If this happened, entities far more dangerous and hostile than the Guardians would be able to penetrate our world. They would begin to hunt people, especially those with even minimal psychic abilities. My loved ones, my wife, parents, friends, would be the first to suffer. Their deaths would be agonizing and strange, and no one would be able to understand what was happening. The only way to prevent this catastrophe was to accept the inheritance and become the new intermediary between worlds. But this meant giving up a normal life, dedicating myself to serving forces I didn't understand and couldn't control. It meant condemning myself to loneliness because loved ones wouldn't be able to understand and accept what I would become. I closed the diary and sat in my grandmother's armchair, trying to process what I had read. Outside, night had fallen, and the house was filled with familiar sounds, creaking, rustling, barely audible whispers. Now I understood that it wasn't a product of my imagination. These were the voices of the Guardians waiting for my decision. For the next 3 days, I was immersed in agonizing contemplation. During the day, I tried to return to a normal life, calling work, talking to my wife, doing ordinary things. But every time I tried to distract myself from what I had learned, reality reminded me with new, strange occurrences. The phone would ring, but when I answered, I heard only whispers and incomprehensible words in a foreign language. The mirrors in the house began to reflect not only my image, but also dark figures standing behind me. Though when I turned around, no one was there. Natasha started to worry. I looked terrible. I wasn't sleeping, barely eating, and was constantly tense and irritable. She suggested seeing a doctor, taking a vacation, or visiting her parents in the countryside. But how could I explain to her that the problem wasn't stress or overwork? That the responsibility for maintaining the barrier between worlds lay on my shoulders? That if I didn't accept my grandmother's inheritance, I would condemn not only her, but many other people to death? I tried to find alternative solutions. I studied my grandmother's books, searching for mentions of ways to break the covenant with the Guardians. But all sources were unanimous. Such agreements were eternal, and the only way to be freed from them was the death of the entire family line. The Guardians did not release their servants so easily because each intermediary was an invaluable asset to them, a gateway between dimensions. On the 4th day, the Guardians' patience ran out. I woke up to someone shaking my shoulder. Opening my eyes, I saw a figure in a dark cloak standing by the bed. The face under the hood was not visible, but I felt a gaze directed at me, cold, ancient, full of inhuman intelligence. The figure didn't speak, but a voice resonated in my head, simultaneously masculine and feminine, young and old. Time is running out, heir. The barriers weaken with each passing hour. Soon they will fall, and then chaos will begin. Your grandmother understood her responsibility. We hope you will prove equally wise. I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. The figure continued to stand by the bed, and I felt a chill emanating from it that penetrated to my very bones. Finally, I managed to force out a few words. What if I refuse? The laughter that echoed in response was like the sound of breaking bones. Refusal is not provided for in the covenant. You can try to ignore your obligations, but this will only delay the inevitable and make the consequences more catastrophic. We are patient, but not infinitely so. You have 3 days to make your decision. After that, we will act independently. The figure began to dissolve, becoming transparent, but the voice in my head remained just as clear. Think of your wife, your parents. They will be the first to feel the consequences of your stubbornness. Their suffering will be long and agonizing. When the vision disappeared, I found myself trembling all over. The sheets were soaked with cold sweat, and the room smelled of sulfur and something rotten. On the nightstand next to the bed lay a sheet of paper that hadn't been there before. It depicted a symbol, a complex geometric figure surrounded by letters in an unknown language. Below the symbol was a caption in Russian. Seal of acceptance. Apply to the body with your own blood under the light of the full moon. I understood that this was the ritual my grandmother had written about in her diary. The final step to accepting the inheritance, after which there would be no turning back. I had 3 days to decide if I was willing to sacrifice my life to protect my loved ones and people I didn't even know. I spent the first day trying to find other options. I called acquaintances who were interested in esotericism, tried to contact people who might know something about such covenants. But all my attempts were futile. Most of the people I spoke to dismissed my story as delusion or mental illness. The few who took my words seriously could only offer general advice on protecting against negative energy, which was useless in my situation. On the second day, the warnings began. Natasha called me at work, weeping. She said that in the morning on her way to the store, she was attacked by a flock of crows. The birds attacked purposefully, as if carrying out someone's orders. She managed to take shelter in a doorway, but her face and hands were scratched by their claws. The doctors at the emergency room couldn't explain such behavior from birds. Crows usually don't attack people without provocation. That same evening, my father called me. His voice trembled with fear and incomprehension. He said strange things had started happening in their apartment. Doors opened and closed on their own, scratching sounds came from the walls, and at night my mother woke up to someone breathing in her face, though no one else was in the room. I understood that the guardians weren't joking. They had indeed begun to affect my loved ones, demonstrating their power and seriousness of intent. This was only the beginning. Mild warnings meant to make me make the right decision. If I continued to resist, the impact would intensify. On the third day, I gave in. Not because I believed in the nobility of my mission or felt a calling to serve higher powers, simply because I could no longer watch the people I loved suffer. Natasha was afraid to leave the house. My parents weren't sleeping at night, and I felt guilty for their torment. In the evening, I returned to my grandmother's house to perform the ritual of accepting the inheritance. The full moon was due to rise around midnight, and I had a few hours to prepare. I took out all the necessary items from the hiding place: black candles, a silver knife, salt to create a protective circle. All of this was described in detail in the instructions my grandmother had left. The ritual was to be performed in the house's basement, where my grandmother had set up something like an altar. I had gone down there as a child, but then it seemed to me just a storeroom with old things. Now I understood that it was a sacred place, a center of power where my grandmother performed her most important rituals. The basement was larger than I remembered. In the center stood a stone altar covered with symbols I now recognized from the books. The walls were painted with complex diagrams that, I understood, represented maps of other dimensions. In the corners stood statues depicting creatures that resembled nothing human or animal. I began preparing for the ritual, following my grandmother's instructions. I lit the candles in a specific order, sprinkled salt around the perimeter of the room, creating a protective circle. Every movement had to be precise, every word spoken correctly. The slightest mistake could lead to catastrophic consequences. When everything was ready, I waited for midnight. Moonlight filtered into the basement through a small window near the ceiling, creating a mystical atmosphere. I took the silver knife and began to draw the symbol on my chest, using my own blood as ink. The pain was sharp but tolerable. Much stronger were the fear and the understanding that I was taking an irreversible step. As soon as the last line of the symbol was completed, the basement filled with a strange glow. The air became thick, like water, and I found it hard to breathe. The statues in the corners came alive, their eyes glowing with red fire, and low, guttural sounds began to emanate from their stone mouths. The figures of the guardians materialized before me. There were 3 of them, and each looked different, but all were united by a sense of antiquity and inhuman wisdom. The first resembled a tall man in a black cloak, but instead of a face, he had a void filled with stars. The second resembled a woman, but her skin was like a reptile's. and her eyes burned with violet fire. The third constantly shifted its form, shimmering like liquid, and it was painful to look at him. The voice that echoed in my head belonged to all three at once. "We welcome you, new intermediary. You have made a wise decision. Now you are part of an ancient order, a guardian of the boundaries between worlds. Your service will be long and arduous, but the reward will be commensurate." I felt something changing within me. The blood in my veins became hot, my consciousness expanded, and I began to perceive reality in a new way. I could see the energy flows connecting all living things, feel the presence of entities from other dimensions, understand the hidden laws governing the world. But along with the new abilities came the understanding of the price I would have to pay. Every use of the gift would take a part of my life. I would age faster than normal, and every serious ritual would hasten my death. But the most terrifying thing, I began to understand that I would gradually lose connection with ordinary people, including those I loved. The guardians explained my duties. I had to maintain the protective barriers, preventing dangerous entities from entering our world. I had to help people who accidentally came into contact with paranormal phenomena, heal those affected by evil from other dimensions. And most importantly, I had to prepare the next heir when the time came. "Your wife will conceive in 3 months," the guardian said. "The child will be special. He will inherit abilities stronger than yours. You will have to train him, prepare him to accept the inheritance. This is your primary task." These words struck me like lightning. I realized that my descendants would also be condemned to the same fate as me. The covenant with the guardians was not just a personal obligation, but a curse that would haunt my family for generations. The ritual ended and the guardians disappeared, leaving me alone in the basement. I felt completely different, stronger, wiser, but at the same time more alone than ever. The blood on my chest dried, turning into a scar that would remind me of my accepted obligations for the rest of my life. The following weeks became a period of adaptation to a new reality for me. The abilities manifested gradually, and I learned to control them. I could see people's auras, predict illnesses, feel the presence of supernatural forces. But each use of these abilities became more difficult for me. Natasha noticed the changes in my behavior. I became more withdrawn, often lost in thought, avoiding physical intimacy. She tried to talk to me, but I couldn't explain what was happening. How do you tell the person you love that you're no longer entirely human? That your soul partly belongs to entities from another world? Work became a torment. I could no longer concentrate on programming. My thoughts were constantly occupied with my new responsibilities. Colleagues began to avoid me. They sensed that something was wrong with me, although they couldn't understand what. A month after the ritual, I was fired for inefficiency and inappropriate behavior, but I acquired new clients. People who encountered paranormal phenomena somehow found their way to me. Rumors of my abilities spread quickly, and soon I became known as the person who could help in cases where ordinary medicine and psychology were powerless. I healed the possessed, cast spirits out of houses, protected people from curses and hexes. Each case required enormous energy expenditure from me, and I felt myself aging before my eyes. My hair began to turn gray. Wrinkles appeared on my face. My movements became less confident. But I couldn't stop. People needed help, and I was the only one who could provide it. Natasha did conceive 3 months after the ritual, just as the guardians had predicted. She was happy, but I felt only horror. I knew that our child would be doomed to the same fate as me. He would be the bearer of a gift that would be both a blessing and a curse. During my wife's pregnancy, I seriously considered suicide for the first time. It seemed to me that it was the only way to break the chain of curses, to prevent evil from touching my unborn child. But when I tried to carry out my plan, the guardians intervened. They explained to me that my death would not free the family from its obligations, but only make the transfer of the gift more painful and dangerous. My son was born on a cold October night. He was beautiful and healthy, but I immediately felt the presence of the same power within him that now lived in me. His eyes were too knowing for a newborn, and when he cried, strange things began to happen in the house. Lights flickered, doors opened on their own, and undefined sounds came from empty rooms. Natasha noticed nothing unusual, or pretended not to. She was happy, completely absorbed in motherhood, and I didn't want to destroy her joy with stories about our son's dark inheritance. Let her be happy for at least a few years, until the child grew up and his abilities fully manifested. But the more time passed, the stronger my estrangement from my family became. I loved them both, but I couldn't be truly present with them. Too many secrets, too many obligations, too many dangers surrounded me. I became like my grandmother in her final years, wise, powerful, but lonely and weary. Natasha began to suspect I had another woman. She couldn't find another explanation for my behavior, my unwillingness to spend time at home, my nocturnal absences. She tried to follow me, but how could I explain to her that I spent nights in abandoned buildings, exorcising demons, or in hospitals, lifting curses from dying people? Conflicts between us became more frequent. Natasha demanded explanations, threatened divorce, cried, accused me of destroying our family. I couldn't explain anything to her, and this made me even more miserable. I watched as I lost the person I cherished most, but I didn't know how to prevent it. It all ended one December evening when my son was 8 months old. I returned home after a particularly difficult case. I had to deal with a very powerful negative entity that had possessed a teenager. The exorcism ritual drained so much of my strength that I could barely stand. Natasha met me in the hallway with a suitcase in her hands. She was pale but resolute. "I can't take this anymore," she said. "I don't know what's happening to you, but you're not the man I married. I'm taking Dimka and going to my mother's. If you want us back, you'll have to sort out your problems first." I looked at her and knew she was right. I truly wasn't the person I used to be. The gift had changed me, made me a stranger to my own family. But I also understood that I could do nothing to reclaim my former life. The path I was on was a one-way street. I didn't stop her. I simply kissed her goodbye and told her I loved her and always would. When the door closed behind them, the house became as empty and silent as my grandmother's house after her death. I was left alone with my abilities, my obligations, and the burden of guilt for having destroyed the lives of the people closest to me. Loneliness became my constant companion. Days blurred into an endless succession of calls from people who needed my help. I became known in certain circles as someone who could handle any paranormal manifestation. Desperate parents whose children were possessed sought me out, as did homeowners whose houses harbored evil spirits and individuals who had fallen victim to curses and hexes. Each case sapped more of my life force. I watched my reflection in the mirror grow more gaunt with each passing day. My skin took on an unhealthy gray hue, my eyes became sunken, and my hair turned almost completely white. I was only 35, but I looked 50. The price for wielding the gift was relentless and unforgiving. Worst of all, I gradually lost the ability to experience normal human emotions. Joy, sorrow, anger, all became alien and distant to me. I could comprehend these feelings intellectually, but I couldn't truly feel them. The only thing that remained constant was my love for my son and wife, but even that transformed into something more abstract, devoid of living warmth. Natasha did not return. Once a month she sent photos of Dimka, and I watched him grow, his face change, his personality develop. But I also noticed signs she didn't see. A peculiar gleam in the boy's eyes, an unnaturally developed intuition for his age. Strange occurrences that happened around him. One day, Natasha called me in tears. She said that Dimka, who was then 4 years old, had started talking to invisible friends. This would be normal for a child his age, but his imaginary companions knew things they couldn't possibly know. They told the boy about events happening in other parts of the city, predicted who would visit, and warned of dangers. I understood that my son's abilities had begun to manifest much earlier than mine. The Guardians were accelerating events, preparing a new intermediary. I didn't have much time left, and they wanted to ensure the successor would be ready to accept the inheritance. I asked Natasha to bring Dimka to me for the weekend. I needed to begin his training, to prepare him for what was inevitably to come. She agreed, hoping that spending time with his father would help the boy cope with his peculiarities. When I saw my son after 6 months apart, my heart ached with pain. He was a beautiful, intelligent child, but his eyes already held the same sorrow I saw in the mirror. He looked at the world with an understanding beyond his years, and I knew that this understanding would bring him only suffering. Dimka wasn't afraid of me, though my appearance might have frightened a child. On the contrary, he gravitated towards me as if to a kindred spirit. We spent time together, playing, talking, and I watched him eagerly absorb my every word, every gesture. He felt something familiar in me, something that explained his own difference from other children. I began to gently prepare him for the truth about our family. I told him stories about his great-grandmother, about how some people can see and feel more than others. Dimka listened attentively, sometimes asking questions that astonished me with their depth. It was clear he understood much more than he let on. On the last day of his stay with me, an event occurred that changed everything. We were sitting in the garden near the house when Dimka suddenly froze and stared intently into empty space. His eyes widened, and he began to speak in a voice that was not childlike. "They are coming, Papa, the dark ones. They are very evil and want to cause harm. But the light ones are coming too. There will be a battle and many will suffer." I felt chills run down my skin. My son saw what was hidden from my eyes despite all my abilities. His gift was stronger than mine, and this meant that the danger he sensed was real and serious. That same night, I had a dream that was more like a vision. I stood on the edge of an abyss from which dark figures rose. They were not like the Guardians. These creatures radiated pure evil, a thirst for destruction and chaos. They ascended from the depths, breaking through the barriers that held them in other dimensions. The voice of one of the Guardians echoed in my head. "The great rupture is approaching. The forces of chaos are gathering for a final assault on the barriers. Your strength is not enough to hold them. A new intermediary is needed, stronger, younger." I understood that they were referring to Dimka. The Guardians wanted me to pass the gift to him immediately, without waiting for him to grow older. Only the combined strength of 2 intermediaries could prevent a catastrophe. But this meant condemning a 4-year-old child to a fate that had destroyed my life. In the morning, I took Dimka back to his mother, but I didn't tell her what I had learned. How could I explain to a woman that her son must bear the burden of protecting the world from the forces of evil? That the alternative would be an apocalypse that would destroy all life? The following weeks, I spent frantically searching for another solution. I studied ancient texts, consulted with the spirits of deceased mages, and tried to find a way to strengthen the barriers without involving my son. But all my attempts were unsuccessful. The forces of chaos were too powerful, and only the sacrifice of a new generation could stop them. Meanwhile, strange events began to occur throughout the city. People reported encounters with ghosts, poltergeist activity in homes, and animals behaving aggressively without apparent reason. The number of suicides and accidents sharply increased. The barriers were indeed weakening, and dark forces were seeping into our world. I understood that time was running out. Every day of delay brought catastrophe closer, but I couldn't bring myself to condemn my own son to the same fate that had ruined my life. I sought compromises, alternatives, any way to avoid the inevitable. The solution came unexpectedly. While studying my grandmother's diaries, I stumbled upon a mention of a ritual of ultimate sacrifice. It was a way to transfer all accumulated power to one person, but the price was absolute. The intermediary died, giving all their life force to strengthen the barriers. This ritual could prevent catastrophe, but only for one generation. I realized this was my way out. I could save the world without condemning my son to my fate. Dimka would gain abilities, but he wouldn't be bound by the covenant with the Guardians. He could live a normal life, use his gift at his own discretion, or ignore it altogether. The ritual of ultimate sacrifice was to be performed on the winter solstice, when the boundaries between worlds become thinnest. I had 2 weeks to prepare. I spent this time putting my affairs in order, writing letters to Natasha and Dimka, explaining to them as much as possible what had happened and why I had made such a decision. In the letter to my wife, I told the truth about our family, about the gift passed down through generations, about what I had to endure. I asked her to forgive me for not being a normal husband and father, for condemning her to loneliness. I explained that my death would free Dimka from the curse, that he would be able to live an ordinary life. To my son, I wrote a different letter, which he was to read when he grew up. I told him who we were, about our abilities, about the responsibility that rested upon us. I explained that he was free to choose his path, but if he ever decided to use his gift, he should remember the consequences. The day before the ritual, I visited their house one last time. I didn't go inside. I just stood outside and looked at the lit windows. Dimka was playing in the living room. Natasha was preparing dinner. They looked happy, and I knew I had made the right decision. My death would give them a normal life, protect them from the nightmare I had experienced. The ritual of ultimate sacrifice was complex and painful. I performed it in my grandmother's basement, in the same place where I had once accepted the inheritance. But now, I wasn't summoning powers to myself. I was giving them back, sacrificing my own life to strengthen the barriers between worlds. The pain was unbearable. I felt every cell of my body burning, my soul tearing apart. But I continued to recite the incantations, performing the necessary actions. I thought of Dimka, of Natasha, of all the people who would live in safety thanks to my sacrifice. As the ritual neared its end, the Guardians appeared before me. They looked sorrowful, if such a concept could be applied to beings of their level. One of them spoke. "You have chosen the path of a hero, but also the path of a betrayer. You will save this world, but you will condemn future generations to even greater suffering. The forces of chaos will not disappear. They will only bide their time, gathering strength for a new attack. And when they return, humanity will have no protector." I knew they were right. My sacrifice was a temporary solution, a postponement, not a final victory. But I couldn't have done otherwise. I couldn't condemn my own son to a life full of suffering and loneliness. I spent the last minutes of my life reflecting on what I was leaving behind. Dimka would grow up unaware of our family's dark inheritance. He would become an ordinary person, find love, start a family, be happy. That was enough for me, but in the very last moment, as my consciousness began to fade, I felt something strange. The connection between me and my son did not disappear with my death. On the contrary, it grew stronger. I understood that my sacrifice had not freed him from the gift, but had amplified his abilities many times over. Horror gripped me as I realized what had happened. The ritual of ultimate sacrifice had not destroyed the family curse, but had only passed it to the next generation in a concentrated form. Dimka would receive not only my abilities, but also the abilities of all previous generations of our family. He would become the most powerful intermediary in history, but also the most unhappy. His gift would be so strong that he would not be able to live among ordinary people. He would see and feel too much, know too much, bear the responsibility for the entire world. I tried to stop the ritual, but it was too late. The process had gone too far, and I could not reverse it. The last thought that flashed through my mind before death was the understanding that I had not saved my son, but had condemned him to a fate far more terrible than my own. The Guardians vanished, taking my soul with them. My body turned to dust, leaving nothing behind but an empty basement and the smell of sulfur. But somewhere else in the city, a 4-year-old boy woke from a nightmare seeing his father's death and cried, not understanding that in that moment his life had changed forever. Years later, when Dimka grows up and his abilities fully manifest, he will understand that his father did not save him, but cursed him. He will hate me for this choice, for condemning him to loneliness and suffering. And he will be right. Such is the price of trying to cheat fate. We cannot escape what is destined for us by the stars. We can only choose how to accept our lot. I chose a path that seemed heroic, but turned out to be a road to even greater evil. Now I exist in the space between worlds, watching my son slowly transform into the very thing I was, but many times worse. He will be the most powerful and the most miserable man on earth. And all this is the result of my attempt to save him. Some curses cannot be broken. They can only be passed on, hoping that the next generation will be wiser and stronger. But wisdom and strength often become an even greater curse than ignorance and weakness. Such is the story of my family. A story of how love can become a curse, how sacrifice can turn into evil, how an attempt to save loved ones can destroy them. And this story is not over yet. It will continue through my son, through his children, through all future generations of our lineage. The dark forces await. They know that sooner or later they will find a way to break into our world. And when that happens, humanity will have only one protector, my son, who will hate me for what I have made him. Perhaps that hatred will become his strength. Perhaps it will help him find a way to break the curse that I only intensified. But that is another story. Mine ended in that basement where I thought I was saving my son, but in reality I was destroying him. Such is the price of pride, the price of trying to change the unchangeable. Some lessons can only be learned at the cost of other lives, and that is the most terrible curse of all.